Hi everyone, as Elizabeth said, I'm Astrid,
And I'm
and
Serena.
we're going to be discussing the ethics of human challenge trials regarding past trials and the COVID-19 vaccine, and we're going to be analyzing the safety and the science of them. Also, if someone's annotating on the screen, can you not draw on that? Thanks. Okay, so we're going to start off with some poll questions. So you can see at the top of the screen, you can either go on the website and type in that like code or text the number and it will bring you to the website. So we'll give everyone a couple minutes to join that. But the first question is, do you think human experimentation is ethical? Okay, interesting to see that the majority of people think it depends on the circumstances and that there is some no answers, which we didn't get when we did this like presentation to the class. So that's really interesting to see. So I think we have enough answers. So I'm going to move on to the next one, which is, wait a minute. Okay, is human experimentation inevitable?
Interesting. That's different from what we got from the class. I see that all we have people who believe in all three choices.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, we haven't seen the it's not necessary and can be avoided answer before, so it's interesting. And we're going to be doing these polls again at the end of the presentation, so you can see if your opinions have changed. And you can keep your phones out during the presentation because we're going to be using the same site, so just keep that open so you can use the polls again.
Thank you for your responses. And before we discuss human challenge trials, we first need to establish some background information. So, a human challenge trial is an experiment where humans are infected with the disease in a lab to let scientists track the progress of a disease and see if a medication works, if there is one. Next, an institution, according to the Civil Rights Act for Institutionalized Persons Act, an institution is any facility or an institution which is owned, operated, or managed by or provides services on behalf of the state, and which is for persons who are mentally ill, disabled, or chronically ill or handicapped. An example of an institution would be a prison or an orphanage. And finally, an institutionalized person is someone who has been living in an institutionalized environment and is no longer able to live independently outside of that institution. Common behavior of an institutionalized person is that can be summarized in the phrase that mortification of self, because while in an institutionalized environment, people often go through a process called the mortification of self, where, as described by Winnie S. Chow and Stephen Priby from BMC Psychiatry, during this process, a person's sense of individuality is taken away in order for them to take on a purely institutionalized role. With this loss of individuality, an institutionalized person may lose the capacity or ability to make their own informed decisions. Now that we have established some background information, let's discuss a historically controversial human challenge trial. A, the Monster Studies was a studying experiment conducted by Dr. Wendell Johnson and graduate student Mary Tudor in January to May of 1939 in Davenport, Iowa. In the experiment, 22 children at the Sailors' Orphan Home were experimented on in order to possibly deduce the origin of and possibly cure stuttering. Mary Tudor and 5 other graduate students listened to the children talk and deemed 10 out of the 22 stutterers. The remaining 12 were chosen at random and split into 2 equal groups called 11A and 11B. In group 11A, which is where the controversy arises, children were told that their speech was abnormal and they knew that they were beginning to stutter. They were also told that they must correct this behavior. In group 11B, children were treated as normal speakers and given compliments. The purpose of this experiment isn't clear because the caretakers in the orphanage were told that the children were to receive speech therapy. However, it's clear that she was trying to deduce the origin of stuttering by trying to induce it into healthy children. However, she also told stutterers that they were healthy, which was in line with what she told to the caretakers. In the end, the results can be split into positive and negative. On the more positive side, we have the diagnosogenic theory, which states that stuttering occurs when a listener criticizes a child's developmental speech impediments. Because of this, many started working directly with children to help them with their speech impediments instead of outrightly criticizing them. It is believed that this theory is the underpinning of most childhood speech intervention in America. On the more negative side, the children in group 11A, which were the non-stuttering children who were told that they needed to change, their grades fell, they were very hesitant to speak as they were focused on correcting themselves, and they were also very self-conscious. As one child stated, "It just ruined my life, I can't talk no more." Before evaluating the ethicality of the experiment, it's important to keep in mind that the results of the experiment are still being questioned today, since some found it false after reevaluation because it was found that the children in the experiment were wrongly diagnosed, and that Wendell Johnston was stutterer himself, who famously said that I became a speech pathologist because I needed one. So that raises the question whether intent matters. And in the end, Tudor ended up finding follow-up care to the traumatized children, but we do not know if that was helpful. Before moving on, it is important to acknowledge that even if there were no laws pertaining to the adult, there were laws pertaining to an adult of sound mind right to choose what happens to your own body. There is no legislation pertaining to the regulation of unethical conduct in experimental settings at that time. Looking at the timeline here, the monster studies happened in 1939, and the doctor's trials at Nuremberg, where American judges judged the grievous actions of Nazi doctors during the Holocaust, took place in 1946. The trials resulted in the Nuremberg Code of 1947 and stated that the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Moving on, the National Research Act didn't exist in 1974. In 1974, President Richard Nixon signed it into law, and the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research was formed. The main purpose of that act was to establish basic ethical principles and guidelines that should be followed when conducting HCTs. Some of the guidelines developed including instruction on how to select human subjects, how to conduct a risk-benefit analysis, and define what informed consent is. That National Commission then wrote the Belmont Report in 1979, which was a summary of the topics discussed in the National Research Act. After being published, the report was distributed and made widely available to scientists who may want to conduct their own experiment. And finally, the Civil Rights Act for Institutionalized Persons Act, also known as CRIPA, defined what an institution is and that people who live in these state-run institutions do not lose their basic rights, was signed by the President in May 23rd of 1980. Now, in 2021, HCTs are conducted under these guidelines. However, just because things are legal, it doesn't mean that they are ethical. Let's take a look at a modern controversial human challenge trial.
COVID-19 HCTs are ongoing trials that are being held to test the efficacy and safety of the various COVID-19 vaccines. They're controversial, however, because of the high risk that they pose to the participants due to the uncertainty of the virus. Before I get into details about these trials, I have a couple more poll questions for you guys. So the first question is, have you been vaccinated for the COVID-19 vaccine? Which, considering that you guys are mostly students, it's probably going to be mostly no, but it is important to see because the vaccines are being tested on humans, and it is important to see the results of the testing and how it's being used and how it's benefiting the public. So interesting to see that there is a lot of yes answers and a lot of people that would want to get vaccinated in the future, which I think is really important, so that these trials are actually like benefiting people and not being held for no reason. The next one is, have you ever been involved in any type of human testing, HCT, or clinical trial? Interesting that there are a couple yes answers. Yeah, that's interesting to see. And the last question is, for today, were you aware of the HCTs going on for the COVID-19 vaccine? Very interesting to see that a lot of people were aware of them, or that they knew that there was human testing but didn't know how it worked. So it's interesting to see like what information like people are seeing in the media and what the influence of that is. Okay, so the ethical question that we identified is it ethical to purposely infect someone with a potentially harmful illness for the sake of a larger community? When is human testing necessary, and where should the line be drawn? This question is particularly significant in the case of COVID-19 trials because these trials are occurring because of the urgency of the situation, and it is important to consider whether holding HCTs because it is an emergency situation make them more ethical. Two bioethicists wrote a paper where they expressed their opinions on when they think HCTs are necessary. To them, an unacceptable challenge model would be where infections and would be infections for which treatment is non-existent or ineffective, symptoms are intolerable, and or serious morbidity or mortality is likely to result. It is hard to determine whether or not COVID-19 would fall under this category because there are limited therapeutic options and symptoms vary on a case-by-case basis, and there are a lot of unknowns remaining. The United Kingdom was the first country to publicize that they were considering using HCTs as a part of their testing for the COVID-19 vaccine, followed by the United States. Both of these countries have remained at the forefront of the news for COVID-19 HCTs because of the controversy that follows the topic. Many people view these trials as controversial because of the high level of risk that they pose to individuals and the uncertainty that they are going to produce results whose benefit would outweigh the risks of the trials. There is particular concern with COVID-19 trials because of the high risk of the SARS-CoV-2 strain and the uncertainty of the illness. Challenge trials in both the US and UK have to go through a thorough screening process which varies for each country. So far, there have been more than 30,000 volunteers for the trials, and they are randomly assigned to either the vaccine or the control group. Comparisons of rates of infections and of infectionists between vaccinated and control participants could reveal the degree to which the vaccine being investigated blocks infections compared with other vaccines, earlier infections, or to no intervention. One of the first SARS-CoV-2 HCT was held in the UK in January of 2020 to discover the smallest amount of virus it takes to cause an infection. Up to 90 healthy young people aged 18 to 30 were involved in the study, which has been the case for most trials. Only including young people, however, is controversial because vulnerable older people would be the ones benefiting from the vaccine. However, knowing the rates at which SARS-CoV-2 could develop in a young person could be important to see how the virus develops in general and how much of a risk it is. There's some debate on what strain to use in testing. The use of attenuated strains would reduce the risk to participants, but it would also lengthen the period of time for strain development. There may also be difficulties with picking strains that match the pandemic strains so as to produce results that are more relevant to public health priorities. One of the main risks for COVID-19 HCCs is that there are limited therapeutics available in case a participant does develop serious symptoms. There are many high-risk groups. Older people and people of all ages with pre-existing medical conditions appear to develop serious symptoms more often than others. There are a lot of unknowns remaining about COVID-19 and treatments, and there are new strains that keep developing that make testing more complicated. Many people have said that HCTs for COVID-19 would be unethical because of the lack of information there is about COVID-19 and its symptoms. Another big risk is that because of problematic HCTs in the past, there'll be a mistrust in medicine if trials go wrong. HCTs in the past have targeted minority groups and breached the rights of individuals, so many are hesitant to join HCTs. The death of a participant could lead to backlash and could tarnish the reputation of HCTs and make it more difficult to use them in the future. There are many concerns regarding the vaccine, so a HCT could potentially add to public mistrust. There are many different groups that could be put at risk from COVID-19 HCTs. First, the research participants who receive an active vaccine candidate. Second, the research participants who receive a placebo. And third, all third parties who are in direct contact with the first two groups. In the face of mass global death, morbidity, and impoverishment due to COVID-19, the risks of carefully done challenge trials are justified, however. There would be many benefits to the trial of the vaccine, such as providing considerable benefits to public health by improving and accelerating vaccine development, fewer COVID-19 deaths, and significantly lower social and economic burdens globally. There would also be the benefit of increased knowledge about SARS-CoV-2 and how it affects people's immune systems. While HCTs are not in themselves a quick process, they're faster than field trials, where someone is given the vaccine and goes out in hopes that they'll contract COVID-19. HCTs would benefit society more than field trials because there would be a smaller number of people infected in an HCT and less chance of infection spreading. While in a field trial, you have possibly thousands of people who out in public who may be exposed. I believe that while there are many risks for the trials, in the case of COVID-19, the risks are justified. We also looked into the reasons why people volunteer for HCTs. There are many reasons why someone might want to join, such as a desire to help their loved ones who are at risk, others see it as their duty to help society, others are coerced by media and financial compensations. One volunteer said, I am older, 52, my kids are grown, and I feel like if I can help save people who are not in the same position, then I should do it. Another volunteer who lost half of a leg after a head-on trailer collision wrote, "This would give me a chance to get my sense of self back, to help and protect others, especially my 1-year-old daughter." One volunteer quoted the World War I slogan, "Daddy, what did you do in the Great War?" which shows that these people want to be remembered as heroes and for doing something impactful during this historical time. Another major factor that influences people, however, is coercion, which can take many forms, such as social pressure, financial gain, media influence, and the desire to protect oneself and ensure further treatment. It is hard for people to make a decision that has not been influenced by any outside factors. COVID-19 vaccination promotion has become very present in the media, with many different companies and organizations making advertisements about why you should get vaccinated, such as the Google one on the screen. Another form of coercion is the possibility for preferential treatment in the future because of the risk that they put themselves in. There's also some debate about whether volunteers should be paid for their participation. We raise the question, does the intention of a volunteer matter? Does it matter if they're trying to be noble or just want some extra cash? I personally don't think the intention matters, simply because no matter why they join the trial, they are still participating and having an impact on society and on science.
Before we talk about the ethical values, frameworks, and possible answers to the questions that have arisen, it's important to discuss the stakeholders in this dilemma. In this dilemma, there are three main stakeholders that are involved. The first being experimental subjects, who are the people who are being deliberately harmed and their safety is at stake. Next, we have doctors and scientists, who are the people who are conducting experiments in order to further science and benefit future generations. Their reputation is at stake, as no one can predict the future, and there's no telling that something might go wrong. And lastly, we have society, who are the people who might or might not benefit from the experiment, and society here also includes future generations as well.
We also looked at the values of autonomy and paternalism. Autonomy can be viewed as the predominant justification of informed consent and also as governance over one's own agency. It should be common practice that no person should be forced into a trial if it is not in their wish to do so. Humans should have the right to pursue the type of lifestyle that they want, and medical trials are very risky, especially for COVID-19, since there are so many unknowns about the virus. For COVID-19 trials, there is a lot of debate about who should be allowed to participate. Most researchers have set up their trials so that participants would be people who are not at serious risk of harmful symptoms from COVID-19. There are certain age limits for different trials, but they are generally the same, with participants ranging from 18 to older adults, but excluding elderly people. There are many problems with this, one being that this setup is paternalistic, meaning that the doctors are making a decision for someone else because they believe it is in their best interest. This raises the question, should people be allowed to participate in a human challenge trial, even if they would be putting themselves at risk and the trial could be potentially fatal? Should the doctors and researchers who are designing these trials be prioritizing the safety of the participants or their autonomy more? Protecting people is one counter-argument to autonomy, along with the thought that autonomy can be bad for people since they are making decisions that affect their well-being, and there is a possibility that they don't fully understand the procedure that they are signing themselves up for, which brings us into the importance of the concept of informed consent.
Informed consent is the permission granted in knowledge of possible consequences, typically that which of given to a patient to a doctor for treatment with full knowledge of possible risks and benefits. Following the principle of informed consent, the experimentation on institutionalized populations or on other people who are unable to give informed consent is unethical because human guinea pig culture is a violation of autonomy. If the party being experimented on did not give or is unable to give consent, there's also an issue if there's a lack of information that is unable to be given to the participants. For example, as said before, in the current COVID-19 HCTs, there isn't enough information about the virus since it is relatively new and we are in a state of urgency. Some questions that arise here are whether or not the urgency of the pandemic justified the HCTs, and if other people should be allowed to decide for participants in a HCT on behalf of the person who lacks the capacity to make the decision.
For our ethical analysis, we looked at HCTs with the values of respect, responsibility, safety, and medical justice, and through the lens of virtue ethics and utilitarianism. One of the main ethical questions that we have looked at is how do we balance respect for individuals involved in a study with scientific advancement? There is always going to be a desire to further research, but we have to make sure that we set boundaries between science and respecting the value of human life. There are many standards that talk about how people should be treated in trials and how trials should be carried out. One is the Declaration of Helsinki, which was written in 1964. One of the notable points that is written in the Declaration is that while the primary purpose of medical research is to generate new knowledge, this goal can never take precedence over the rights and interests of individual research subjects. This shows that we must respect the inherent value of human life. There is some ethical debate over what persons are owed respect. Different answers have been offered, including all human beings, all and only those humans who are themselves capable of respecting persons, all beings capable of rational activity, and all beings capable of functioning as moral agents. People should be respected in a trial regardless of social position, individual characteristics or achievements, or moral merit, but just because they're a human being. One of the ways that trials are made safer is by only allowing healthy young people to participate in a trial because those individuals are at a lesser risk for developing serious symptoms. After HCTs are conducted, however, there can be immune bridging studies done in high-risk populations, which are designed to determine an equivalent immune response in a different group than the initial trial was conducted with. Another way that trials can be made safer is by guaranteeing that participants would receive access to lifelong treatment should any severe symptoms arise. An article from the World Health Organization states that in regards to HCTs, these clinical facilities should be capable of providing continuous monitoring and medical attention at the appropriate points in time after the challenge is given.
Another value at play here is responsibility. Responsibility, or the moral obligation to behave correctly towards or in respect of, is an important ethical value in the dilemma, as all the stakeholders have specific and sometimes conflicting responsibilities. Doctors and scientists have the responsibility to find cures to improve the overall health of society. However, they also have the responsibility to do no harm, and deliberately infecting their patients is doing the exact opposite of that. This raises a question of whether or not human subjects are even needed to test medication meant for humans. Moving on, because experimental subjects are a part of society, we will be speaking of these two stakeholders as one. One of the citizens' duty is to benefit one's community or society as a whole. By being part of a clinical trial, they are aiding scientific development and helping to improve the health of future generations. On the other hand, citizens are more than a part of society. They have their own families and roles in their community. Here, people have a responsibility to do their job. Being in a potentially dangerous clinical trial can have far-reaching consequences. For example, if a single parent is harmed during a trial and deemed unable to work, their children will have to suffer the consequences.
One way to evaluate whether HCTs are ethical or not is through the lens of medical justice, which is the idea that the burdens and benefits of new or experimental treatments must be distributed equally among all groups in society. In the case of HCTs, the benefits and burdens would not be equally distributed, since the participants of the trial would be put at risk because they will be infected with a potentially deadly virus, while the recipients of the vaccine would face reduced risk since the virus would have been thoroughly tested. The Belmont report also addresses this issue of justice by saying the selection of research subjects needs to be scrutinized in order to determine whether some classes, for example, welfare patients, particular racial and ethnic minorities, or persons confined to institutions are being systematically selected simply because of their easy availability, their compromised position, or their manipulability, rather than for reasons directly related to the problem being studied. It is important to make sure that vulnerable populations are not being taken advantage of and that they are voluntarily joining these trials and can fully consent.
Moving on to ethical frameworks that apply here, we have virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is an ethical framework that is based on the fact that if the intent is good, a possible unethical action is justified. From a virtue ethicist's view, if a scientist's intent was to improve public health, the experiment is ethical. For example, because Wendell Johnson, Mary Tudor, wanted to deduce the origin of stuttering and cure it, the monster studies were ethical. However, if we continue to evaluate the concept of intent, there are some things that need to be considered. The first of them being we aren't mind readers and we don't know what the true intentions of someone are. Second, we can assume that because someone has experienced an issue, that they have good intentions toward others who have the same issue. Also, we can assume that because someone hasn't experienced an issue, that they have bad intentions. And finally, we don't really know what good intent is and what bad intent is. How do we evaluate someone's intentions as merely good or bad when everyone's sense of good or bad is subjective? As can be seen, if we choose to evaluate the ethical concept with a virtue ethicist view, there are many slippery slopes. An example of another slippery slope is the misuse of utilitarianism in this context. A common argument used to justify unethical experiments is that an experiment is justified if its results will benefit the future. In this argument, utilitarianism is used. Utilitarianism is an ethical theory that states that the ends justify the means. For example, if an experiment produces a life-saving medication, the possible unethicalness of it is justified. However, utilitarianism, when used in this case as justification, is problematic because no one can predict the future, and because of that, there's no way of telling whether or not the consequences will be negative or positive. It is also problematic because this usage dismisses the core principles of utilitarianism, and using it to justify unethical conduct in this case ignores its altruistic core, which focuses on impartial concern for the greater population, rather than taking a permissive view on the harming of individuals for the sake of a greater population. It is very important to understand this distinction. One way to understand it is the Oxford Utilitarianism scale, which splits utilitarianism into two parts, negative and positive. According to the Oxford U Center for Practical Ethics, positive utilitarianism focuses on empathetic concern, identification with the whole of humanity, and concern for future generations, while negative utilitarianism is negatively associated with a permissive attitude towards instrumental harm. The difference between the two is that one sees the greater good as a whole, while the other focuses on using one group to benefit the other group with more people.
So we're going to do the polling questions again, starting with, do you think human experimentation is ethical? So I'll give you guys a second to get the poll up again.
Interesting. I guess
Yeah.
opinion could change.
Yeah, it seemed like it changed. So there used to be some answers for the other options. So it's interesting to see that many people now have changed their minds. So we're going to go to the second question. Do you think human experimentation is inevitable? Interesting that there's no more answers for no, it is not necessary and avoidable. Interesting to see how people's answers changed and that people now think it's more necessary for science. So lastly, we set up some guidelines for what we think is necessary for human experimentation to make it ethical. First guideline is transparency. That all trials should be designed with a clear goal and intention for what the researchers hope to achieve to avoid risks. Another extremely important guideline is the requirement of informed consent, which, as previously discussed, is crucial for all human experimentation. It has to be thorough and all risks have to be made clear to the participants. The third guideline that we identified is discussion, because it is important that researchers find the best experimental design that would produce the least amount of risks, and there should be a discussion about who can participate in the trial, and their informed consent must be given. The last guideline is responsibility. Scientists should take responsibility for possible ramifications. Since they are the ones performing the treatments and designing the trials, they are responsible for making sure that the participants are kept safe. And if anything does happen, the participants should get proper treatment and scientists should be held accountable for their actions.
Before we wrap up, it's important to discuss the concept of human guinea pig culture. Human guinea pig culture is based on people, the guinea pigs, participating in experiments that may be based on unethical conduct to achieve a favorable outcome for the greater good. Even so, if people stop using these unethical measures, it doesn't mean that human guinea pig culture will cease to exist. For example, medicine for humans needs to be tested on humans to make sure it's safe. Also, the possibility of a favorable outcome will continually be used as justification of the harm being caused. In a way, human guinea pig culture in research is inevitable because we are all human. It is a matter of how the research is conducted and how the participants are informed and treated rather than whether or not it's ethical, because anything can be argued to be unethical depending on the perspective. Because we can't avoid human experimentation and guinea pig culture, it's important to understand that we have to be mindful of what we are consuming.
Lastly, we came up with some further questions. The first one being, does the urgency of the COVID-19 pandemic justify speeding up the vaccination process? The next is, can an unknown negative consequence be enough to avoid working towards a known positive outcome? And lastly, can we use information gained through unethical trials? So you guys can think about these and we can have a discussion in a few minutes. If not, thank you. And you have any questions? And I'll leave the slide up with further questions if you guys have any responses to them.
Thank you to Serena and Astrid. That was very informative. If you have a question right now, please raise your hand, or if you're in a classroom, walk up to the D10. And if you are off screen, you can just unmute and speak.
I have a question.
Loud.
Ellie, I have a question.
Yeah, go right ahead, Claire.
Okay, so looking at the principles of virtue ethics and autonomy versus paternalism and informed consent, I was wondering how experiments on institutionalized people change when it's deemed for the individual people's benefits, such as forced sterilizations, when the idea is to prevent the people or the women from getting pregnant.
So that's a good question, and I don't think that our guidelines would change very much because it's the same basic ethical principles apply. And if we take a look at a historical human challenge trial, which a doctor by the name Dr. Cutler tried to see if penicillin had any if penicillin worked to cure STDs, that the medication was for the people being tested on, but it was still unethical because he willingly took advantage of those vulnerable people, and it's a question of whether if others are able to give consent on behalf of the people being experimented on who will possibly benefit from the medication being developed.
Yeah, I agree with what Serena said. The same values of respect have to be looked at in those types of scenarios because there is the value of human life. And I think that our guidelines would still be the same because we want every human to be respected if they're going to be tested on. And we have to make sure that for human experimentation, vulnerable populations are not being taken advantage of, which has happened a lot in the past. So it is important to reevaluate the standards that we have in place and make sure that trials can be held more ethically.
Jumping back to the further questions, because they are very good questions. Does anyone have any specific thoughts on the first question about the urgency of the COVID-19 pandemic and if that justifies speeding up the process? Again, if you're off screen, you can just unmute and speak.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering how you guys weighed like intent and impact and whether you value the intentions of the doctors and scientists more than the actual impact of like a vaccine. And what you think about that?
Yeah, we looked at the intention of the doctors because, like the case that Serena was saying for Dr. Cutler, which was the Guatemala syphilis study, he started the trial with the intention of trying to see if penicillin could cure STDs such as syphilis to help people in the military, but he ended up taking advantage of vulnerable populations, though he did find like some results from it. We don't think that just because a doctor has a good intention when they start a trial, if it leads to unethical results, the trial is still unethical. Though if they have, we were also debating whether if a researcher starts a trial with like unethical intentions, like trying to like harm certain groups, but they end up trying to harm, or they end up getting better results, even though they did harm people, if that would be considered ethical because they did produce beneficial results to the public. But I think that the intention of the doctor, it should be taken into account when analyzing the ethics of a case. But I think the results and what happened in the trials matters more, because if they are harming populations, then that makes the trial unethical, regardless of the intention of the doctor.
Yeah, I agree with Astrid that because we can't read people's minds and consequences, that because we can't predict the future, they should be evaluated separately, and that we should focus on what actually happens. For example, if people died or people were harmed and taken advantage of.
Does anyone have any other questions?
Yeah, I have a quick question. I was wondering that given the recent movement in the public towards ending animal testing, I was wondering how your opinions change given like when the subject is changed to animals, given that you can't establish informed consent. I was just wondering because I think that's a different and unique perspective that hasn't been brought up today.
Yeah, I think that is a really important case to look at, and it does change a lot when you can't get the informed consent of someone or of like an animal, because they are still living beings, so it would be probably deemed unethical by like the standards that we establish to test on them, since you would be harming them. Though I'm not sure, like maybe there'd be some scenarios if it like would benefit the public, but I still think that because they're animals and still like living beings, doing really harmful tests on them would be unethical because of the like standards that we established. But I think it is important to look at like when the like person being tested on changes, like the research subject changes. Do the standards have to change, or can we like continue using the same standards to look at different cases? Because even with different populations who don't have the capacity to give informed consent, like making sure that they don't get taken advantage of and they still have like a voice in the trials, even if they like cannot like give that consent, that they are still being protected.
Yes, and also the same value of respect applies, that no unnecessary or harm should be conducted. So let's say we're testing a medication that is administered by shot. Any other harm besides that shot shouldn't be administered because it is unnecessary and has no benefit to the results of the trial. And I think that there shouldn't be much of a there. Of course, there's the concept of informed consent, and the animals can't give informed consent, but the animals should still be evaluated as living beings and treated with respect.
We are approaching the end of the time, so if anyone has any last questions, either in relation to the further questions that they have up on the slides or just a general question about their project, please speak now. I actually have a question that I'll pose. So do you feel like there's a difference in voluntary consent versus informed consent versus forced informed consent? For example, like when you get a really long terms and conditions, when you download a new app on your phone and you just scroll through and you click I agree to all the terms and conditions. So given those different types of consent, do you feel that that would affect the ethicality of certain challenge trials?
I think it does, because if you are having to like force people or like coerce people into like agreeing to join the trial, then you are taking advantage of them and not respecting them as a human being. So I think that to have informed consent, it has to be voluntary and they have to like be thoroughly informed of all like the risks. And it can't be like a terms and conditions situation. Like they have to know every single thing, to make sure that they are fully aware of whatever they're signing themselves up for, since medical procedures and trials are really risky. To reduce that risk, we want to make sure that they can fully understand every part of the trial. And it's up to like the doctors to make sure that they are getting that informed consent. But I think it would change the ethicality of it if the participants have not fully given their informed consent, or like the ways that it was given, because of like populations being taken advantage of. Because for like Dr. Cutler in the Guatemala syphilis study, he took advantage of populations because they could not give consent and because they did not have the capacity to make those decisions. So it is important to see like whether or not the people being tested on could have given consent or not.
Great, thank you. Does anyone have any other questions? Particularly, I'm curious to see if anyone has any responses to further question number 3, because I think that is a very loaded question. So if nobody has any further questions, we will end this workshop here. We hope that you enjoyed this workshop. We will now take a short break. The next session will start at 10:50, so you have about 8 minutes until then. And please make sure to join us on the associated Zoom link for session 2. Thank you so much.
Do we begin at 10:45 or is everything being pushed back
I
a little?
think 5 minutes, they pushed it back, so 10:50.
Okay, I'm just here because I'm ready. And I'm going to start the whole thing. Is that like,
Yeah, so yeah, you're going to, I'm just gonna be in the background. I'm gonna be letting people in. So
okay,
yeah,
sounds good.
yeah, I mean, let me just see, we need
So we'll start
Alana.
at like 10:50.
Yeah, let me just get Alana in and then, oh,
Hi, Lana. Good luck.
Thanks, Georgia.
where is, so do you think, I mean, I would assume Lisa Washburn is maybe Elizabeth. I don't see Elizabeth on the list yet. Make sure you name yourself, Alana, with just your first name, right? Hmm.
Do you want me to send Lizzie a text?
Yeah, I mean, I want to make sure that if Lisa Washburn is not her.
Lisa Washburn's her mom.
Okay, so, but maybe she's logged in somehow under her mom, because I'm not seeing her in the waiting room.
Some of the other presentations.
Yeah,
I think she's still watching.
Lisa Washburn?
Yeah. I'll go
Hi.
see if she's downstairs. I'll go see whether she's
Oh, thank
logged
you.
in.
And Alana, just remember, if
Oh,
you're
wait,
the one,
I got her.
if you're the one sharing the screen, like make sure that when I'm talking about like the logistical information, you have like that slide up.
Okay, maybe I'll put my screen up like now. Oh wait, can you make me a co-host so I can share my screen? Thank you. Yeah, I'll pull it up now so it's ready when everyone comes in.
Okay, perfect. And then when I say I will now turn the presentation over to our speakers, Alana and Lizzie, thank you. Like that's obviously take it away. And then at the end, like they're going to send me questions via the chat and then I will ask the questions out loud to you and I'll call on people from the D10s. But I saw in the other sessions, like some of the D10s, like people would just come up and unmute, which like I guess is inevitable. So that'll be fine too. So yeah. Okay, you guys got this. Woo!